Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Trump Watch, the show that keeps a watch on Donald Trump and where I analyze and report to you what's been going on during the past week. So one of the big pieces of news in Donald Trump's political life is his announcement that he is going to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin in an effort to resolve the 3-year-long war between Ukraine and Russia. For his part, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, is upset about this. He feels that he should be part of any negotiations, and he's even indicated that he may not sign off on any deal in which he hasn't participated. Now, the real question arises is, what is Trump doing? Why is he getting involved in this whole resolution of this conflict? What's the point of sitting down with Putin and trying to reach a peace deal, especially a peace deal that's going to involve Ukraine, who, at least at this point of the negotiations, is playing no role? And from a libertarian standpoint, it's clear that Trump is not a non-interventionist. I mean, we've been pointing that out for many, many years now. Trump is an interventionist. He wants to be a player here on the world scene. He wants to be the guy that's moving and shaking and resolving things around the world. He wants to acquire Greenland and an imperialist escapade and the Panama Canal and Gaza, and now he wants to be the big resolver of this war. That is exactly contrary to the non-interventionist and non-imperialist principles of libertarianism. So what's the libertarian solution? Just come home. That's all Trump has to do, is just bring all U.S. troops home from Eastern Europe, from Western Europe too, for that matter. Stop funding Ukraine. Just get out. But you see, that mindset is anathema to an interventionist, both Republican and Democrat. I mean, it was anathema to Biden. It's an anathema to every Democrat. It's an anathema to every Republican. They are interventionists. They want to be intervening in other parts of the world in one way or the other. That's what got us the Vietnam War. It's got us the Korean War, the Afghanistan War, that 20-year conflict where there still hasn't been any soul searching involved in that conflict, because the Ukraine conflict occurred right after that, coincidentally. Well, it wasn't coincidental, as we'll talk about in a minute. And then there was, of course, the war of aggression against Iraq, a country that had never attacked the United States. So we've got a one-party system, the Democratic-Republican Party, that are interventionists. All that Trump has to do is announce no more foreign aid. Okay, he says he's questioning foreign aid. Okay, no more foreign aid to Ukraine. And then no more troops over there. Now, the Europeans are all upset because they want to be part of these negotiations too. And, well, maybe one benefit from this is that maybe they'll get so upset that they'll tell Trump to cancel all his military bases over there. I mean, the U.S. has had military bases. It's essentially been occupying Germany since the end of World War II. And then we've got all these military bases in Eastern Europe. And the best thing that Trump could ever do is just bring all the troops home, including from Western Europe. What are they doing over there? But the real core of the problem here with Ukraine is NATO. And there is no indication that Trump is willing to get out of NATO, disband NATO. Well, if the U.S. got out of NATO, it's almost a certainty that NATO would disband. But that's the root of the problem here. In any agreement that he negotiates with Putin, what's he do with NATO? As long as NATO is there, which is, of course, controlled by the Pentagon and the CIA, they're a constant threat. And that's what motivated the Russians to invade in the first place. This is what Trump doesn't want to contend with. It certainly isn't what the mainstream press, many of whom are, of course, Operation Mockingbird assets of the Pentagon and the CIA, they don't want to confront. They keep talking in terms of the Russian aggression, like they're appalled by this aggression. Well, if they're so appalled by aggression, how come they're not appalled by the aggression against Iraq? I mean, that was a clear-cut war of aggression. It violated every principle of the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal against wars of aggression. The United States was the attacker, the invader, the occupier, killing multitudes of people. And yet, there's no outrage there. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. They tell every single soldier who served in Iraq. And Afghanistan is really no different. They've justified that one by saying, oh, they were harboring terrorists, Osama bin Laden. That's pure nonsense. What they called harboring was the Taliban regime's refusal to comply with George Bush's unconditional extradition demand. You see, because terrorism is a criminal offense. Like it or not, it is a criminal offense. And that means extradition. And there is no extradition agreement between Afghanistan and the United States. So the Taliban regime didn't have to, under principles of law, extradite bin Laden. And they call that, harboring. Well, pure nonsense. It was another war of aggression. There's no getting appalled over that in the mainstream press, but it's only when Russia aggresses against Ukraine. Well, it's not so simple, though. And this is the thing that they keep trying to avoid whenever they talk about this war. After the end of the Cold War, the Pentagon and the CIA were in desperate need of a new official enemy. The Cold War racket had proven to be very beneficial to the national security establishment, specifically the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. And I call it a racket because it was a racket. The Russians are coming. Be scared of the communists. The communists are everywhere. They're in Cuba, 90 miles away. They're in Korea. Oh my gosh. They're in Hollywood. And look under your bed. There's a communist. That's what the McCarthy hearings were all about. And all that fear-mongering, of course, generates this new official enemy, the Soviet Union, and to a certain extent, Red China. And the Soviet Union, ironically, had been America's partner and ally in World War II. But as soon as they lose that official enemy of Nazism, they get a new one, the communist threat, which ironically had been Hitler's enemy too during the war and even before the war. Hitler had two big enemies, and that was communism and terrorism. Isn't that kind of interesting? So at the end of the Cold War, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA were panicky. Like, what do we do? What do we do now? Because people were talking about a peace dividend and going to end this, or at least drastically reduce the massive military spending. And so they were freaking out about it. And they said, "Oh no, wait, we can fight the drug war." You see, they were looking for a new official enemy, and then they got Saddam Hussein with the Persian Gulf War, and they left him in power, and he becomes the new official enemy for 11 years. I mean, it was constantly Saddam, Saddam, Saddam. People who were not born yet during that era, you were spared because it was miserable. Saddam's coming to get us. He's coming to get us. It was like the Reds coming to get us. They had a new official enemy. But in the meantime, what a lot of people didn't realize is that the Pentagon and the CIA had not given up with Russia as an official enemy. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had dismantled. The Berlin Wall had come down. East and West Germany were united. And the Soviet soldiers, the Russian soldiers, were all taken back to Russia. So Eastern Europe, which the Soviets or Russia had been occupying during the whole 40-something years of the Cold War, they were now free and independent from Russian control. So Russia secured a promise from U.S. officials that NATO, which remained in existence, which was bizarre, big mistake, because NATO was just a dinosaur, a Cold War dinosaur. The ostensible reason for NATO was to protect Western Europe from a Soviet attack, which was ridiculous because the Soviet Union had been totally devastated in World War II. I mean, they were the ones that paid the biggest price in terms of the millions of people that were killed, the entire industrial base of the country destroyed. I mean, they were flat on their back by the end of that war. And the Nazis were defeated, but the United States, they didn't have any problems because nobody had invaded the United States Not so with Russia. I mean, they were just absolutely devastated economically. And so the thought that they were going to start a new war against Western Europe, knowing that the United States was there prepared to back them up with nuclear weapons, and the U.S. was the only one who had nuclear weapons at that time, and the willingness to use them on populated cities is ridiculous. But they bring in this NATO thing they keep NATO in existence, but the Russians secure a promise that you will not use NATO to expand eastward toward Russia's borders, and U.S. officials make that promise. Don't worry, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep NATO in existence for some bizarre reason, because the Soviet Union's no longer there anymore. That was the reason for NATO, and with no more Cold War, no more Soviet Union. What do you need NATO for? But they said, we're going to keep it in existence, but we're not going to move eastward. Well, almost immediately, gradually, year after year, they're over here promoting Saddam Hussein, and but they're quietly, gradually absorbing Eastern European countries that had been part of the Warsaw Pact, which was the pact that the Soviet Union had put together that encompassed the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and so forth. So they kept absorbing these countries and moving U.S. bases closer and closer to Russia's border, knowing what the result was, because Russia kept saying, you've got to stop this. You see, and of course, NATO includes Germany, and Germany was the nation that had invaded Russia, and it almost defeated Russia in World War II. So, if anybody's got a right to be paranoid, it's Russia. And of course, the U.S. has its own paranoia, because remember that during the Cold War, the Soviets had installed nuclear missiles in Cuba. Well, Cuba's an independent country, a sovereign country. It has the right to install whatever missiles it wants. So it invites the Soviets to come in and install nuclear missiles. The mainstream press always calls them offensive weapons, but they weren't offensive. They could hit American cities, no question about that, but it was always defensive. It was to protect Cuba from another U.S. invasion. The U.S. had already invaded with the Bay of Pigs invasion, had failed in a catastrophic occurrence there at the Bay of Pigs, where all the U.S. trained Cuban exiles were captured or killed. But the Pentagon kept pressuring for another invasion, and that was what the purpose of the missiles. And so President Kennedy goes to the edge of nuclear war and says, no, we will not let you put these missiles here. We will invade if you insist on keeping them there. And he would have invaded if they'd insisted on that. But they struck a deal where Kennedy promises, we won't invade, promise, and you'll withdraw your missiles. And they said, fine. They got what they wanted. And also they said, well, we want you to take your missiles out of Turkey that are pointed at us. See, no nation likes to have nuclear missiles pointed at them from right nearby, or even far away for that matter. So the U.S. knew what it was doing when it kept getting closer and closer. The Pentagon and the CIA knew what they were doing, getting closer and closer to Russia's border, because that's their position with respect to Cuba or any other country where a so-called adversary nation or a rival nation starts to put in nuclear missiles or even military bases. I guarantee you that if Russia started to put nuclear missiles in Cuba right now, you'd see first a threat of invasion and then an invasion. That's just the way things operate. So when they were absorbing these Eastern European countries, they knew what the result was going to be, especially because Russia kept saying that if you keep doing this and you get all the way to Ukraine, we're going to invade. So, Biden made it look like, oh, I predicted the invasion. I predicted it. It's ridiculous. Russia told him this is what's going to happen. And so that's precisely what they did. They started talking about Ukraine being part of NATO, which would enable the U.S. to take over Crimea, because Ukraine's claiming Crimea, which Russia, of course, took over. Nuclear missiles right there on their border. Military bases, tanks, everything. Russia says, no, we're going to invade. We're going to stop this. And so it's the U.S. that precipitates this war, and Ukraine goes along with it. And this is a thing that I've always questioned. I said, why would a president of a country sacrifice his entire country? I mean, Ukraine's devastated. And they sacrifice all these soldiers, not the young people. Interestingly enough, they don't draft the young people, but they draft the middle-aged guys. But massacred. I mean, just I don't know what the death toll is, but it's like wiped out the whole generation of people. I think like in their 30s and 40s, maybe 50s too. Why would he do that? And they says, oh, for freedom. They're fighting for freedom. That's bull. They did it to join NATO. Joining NATO is not freedom. Okay, it's joining a political dinosaur. Why would you sacrifice your entire country? Well, it's a corrupt regime there. It's always been a corrupt regime. And I think it would be great to do a complete audit of all the millions of dollars that have been flooding into this regime and see where all the money ended up. Because it wouldn't be surprising to me at all if some top generals or top officials in their so-called Defense Department had their bank accounts in the Swiss banks fattened mightily with all this money. But I just can't see why Zelensky would do this. Given the choice of giving up on NATO and preserving his country and wanting to join NATO and sacrificing his whole country. So Trump thinks he's going to resolve all this with Putin, and he might, but I don't see it happening with NATO in existence. The ideal would be just to come home and get out of NATO, bring all the troops home from Europe and Eastern Europe. They've been there long enough. Leave Europe to Europe, okay? And then bring them home. And now, in the meantime, but they don't want to bring them home. They want to bring them over to the Pacific because Trump's over here buying into this notion that China's a rival, what do you call it? An adversary, a competitor, an enemy. I mean, so they've ginned up a new official enemy. If Trump makes nice with Russia, and Russia's taken off the picture for official enemies. There's China, new official enemy. Oh, they're communists. Remember, this is what the Cold War was all about. So the best thing they can do is just bring them out of there. And sitting down there and talking to the Russians and trying to reach a deal on this, just total mess. The U.S. has done enough damage. The Pentagon has done enough damage. The CIA has done enough damage. And the ultimate outcome of here is, of course, the Republicans or the Democrats would never consider it, and that is the dismantling of the whole national security state. And I've talked about this over and over again for many years now, that the worst mistake in American history was the conversion of our federal government from a limited government republic to a national security state. It just been an absolute disaster. And that as long as you have a national security state, you're going to have this official enemies, out of control federal spending on military, on so-called defense. I mean, of course, it's not defense at all. But they always need these official enemies because fear is the coin of the realm. All right, so enough about Ukraine. Let me see what else I want to talk about today. As y'all know, Trump's gone off on this thing of ending DEI, diversity, equity, and what's the other one? I forget what the I is. But I wrote a blog about it today or yesterday. You can take a look at it on how Trump is revamping the whole federal government. And, in my blog, I pointed out that, I don't care how they run the federal government. I'm like Murray Rothbard, that when they said, what do we do about the communists in the federal government? Rothbard says, abolish the jobs. And then the problem goes away. And that's the way I feel, that if you dismantle the whole welfare state and all the departments and agencies and the national security state and the drug war and the war on immigrants, the whole thing, you've got this minuscule federal government with very weak powers, which means a strong nation. But nobody cares. Nobody's going to care how that little tiny federal government's going to operate at that point. But what's interesting is Trump trying to influence the private sector with his anti-DEI stuff. And as I stated in my blog, libertarianism doesn't involve being pro-DEI or anti-DEI. Libertarianism is let every company decide for itself what it wants to do. Get the government out of this. Trump has no business getting involved in the private sector, but it's because everybody's on the dole in the private sector. Not everybody, but a lot of people, a lot of companies, universities, colleges are on the dole. Then the fear of losing the dole causes them to influence their behavior. Now, the other thing is, Trump talked about the plane crash there in Washington, and I want to make a point about this. He said that his hunch was that it was the DEI that caused this, and I'm not really sure what he was alluding to. But one of the things that hasn't been widely publicized that I think should be is why those military helicopters are in that area of Reagan Airport. And the reason why the skies there are filled with this with these military helicopters is because the generals use a helicopter as a taxi to get to the airport. You see, they can't take an Uber because they're generals. You see, they're hot stuff people. They can't lower themselves to take an Uber. So they use these helicopters. It doesn't matter how much it costs. Okay, so we're $36 trillion in debt. What's a few tens of thousands more for a helicopter ride? So these helicopters flood the skies there around Reagan, not only to be ferrying these generals and other elites, political elites, to the airport, but they have to train for it. So you've got helicopters training at the same time as the helicopter taxi service is operating, and that's a recipe for disaster. And that's led to this plane crash, because obviously if there were no helicopters in the sky there would not have been a collision with a helicopter. But of course, Trump doesn't want to criticize the military or interrupt this taxi service for generals and political elites, because he needs the military to enforce his border. He doesn't want to get them upset because he wants their assistance there on the border. I mean, he's militarizing the police state along the border, so that not only do we have a police state down there, we got a militarized police state. And that brings up the drug war, which is another thing that I want to talk to you about this week. That Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, she's announced that she's doubling down on the war on drugs. It's really interesting because, she was a defense attorney and now has become Attorney General, and she's cracking down. She's not hesitating. She's going to win the war on drugs. I mean, this is so ridiculous. As a defense attorney, or I don't know if she was a criminal defense attorney or not, or what kind of law she did, but surely she knows that this is a war that's been going on for decades, especially, with respect to the legal profession. I mean, there's criminal defense lawyers in Florida where she lives that have been making tons of money for decades, since I was a kid. I mean, I grew up on the border, the Texas-Mexico border, as I've indicated in the past, and man, there were lawyers making a killing, including my dad. My dad made a lot of money on drug cases and stuff. And so this war's been going on for decades, but with new record drug busts every decade. Hey, we got a new record drug bust. But she thinks she's going to win it. And you've got the CIA now involved with drones spying on cartels in Mexico, like they're going to really wipe out the cartels. But Trump's talking about that. He's changing the identity of the cartels to terrorist organizations. Well, this means terrorism, the war on terrorism. You see all the armaments in the war on terrorism. This isn't just a civil drug thing, because in the drug war you still got to follow due process. You got to follow rules on search and seizure, right to counsel and stuff. The war on terrorism, all that's out because you see it's considered like a war. Even though it's a criminal offense, it's treated like a war. So torture, indefinite detention, you don't have to give people trials, Guantanamo. Look, they're already moving migrants to Guantanamo. This is their torture center where they torture people and detain them indefinitely forever without trials. There's people there for 20 years without a trial. I mean, I find it interesting. They mock Russia for its show trials, and rightly so. I mean, they know the result before they have these things. But gosh, it seems to me that an argument could be made that a show trial is better than no trial. And but in any event, so the U.S. doesn't have to give any trials, and so now they're moving the war on drugs into the war on terrorism. They're morphing them, and Bondi obviously is signing on to all this instead of objecting and saying, this is so ridiculous. we need to just legalize drugs. It hasn't worked. It's causing a lot of death and destruction. It has destroyed Mexico entirely. And this notion that we're going to go in there and bomb these cartels and kill a bunch of people and we're going to finally win the war on drugs. I mean, how many times did we hear that if we just could extradite those drug cartel leaders from Mexico or Latin America to the United States to be jailed in the Supermax prison in Colorado, that would solve the problem. Okay? Well, they did it. And what good did it do? No good at all. It's just a huge drug war bureaucracy that funds the criminal defense lawyers, that funds the prosecutors, okay, the U.S. attorneys, and the whole drug war bureaucracy, the clerks, the federal judges, everything. Just one great big racket. And they know it's a racket. They know they're not going to win it, but it keeps them in high cotton. And while I'm on the subject of U.S. attorneys, let me wrap up this issue by talking about what's going on in New York with the U.S. Attorney's Office there. Some of you may be familiar with it. The U.S. Attorney's Office there indicted the mayor of New York for bribery and related crimes, Eric Adams. And suddenly the acting U.S. attorney, because they're awaiting a formal confirmation of the Trump-appointed U.S. attorney, her name is Danielle Sassoon, I think, is her name. And Sassoon. And she is impressive, I gotta say. That this guy, Emil Bove, who had been one of Trump's defense lawyers, he's now appointed deputy attorney general or assistant or acting deputy attorney general, not sure. But he orders her to file a motion with the federal judge in New York requesting a dismissal of these charges against Adams. And his reason is not that they lack the evidence, that it's not a good case, but apparently, and this is what the media is reporting, is that they need his cooperation in the war on immigrants. You know, deportation and reporting on immigrants and so forth, and letting them interview them in the jails and so forth. And that's a reason to dismiss a criminal indictment? I mean, over here you've got a public policy thing, and you've got a criminal indictment. Those are two completely separate things. And you have no business mixing the two. You want a criminal justice system where people are charged and treated for the crime that they supposedly committed. And you want everybody treated equally. So if this guy did violate criminal laws against bribery, he should be treated like everybody else, regardless of whether he's in a position to help with the war on immigrants or not. Well, Danielle Sassoon says, no, I will not comply with that. It's very impressive. And so Bove hits the ceiling and says, you have to do this. And she refuses, and she finally realizes that the only way out of this is to resign. So she resigns out of principle. I mean, it's clearly she loves her job, you know, in the U.S. Attorney's Office. She believes in her job. She thought she was doing the right thing. But when he asked her to do this, no, I'm not going to file that motion. So he goes to to other lawyers, I think they're in Washington, and instructed them to file the motion. And they said, no, we're not going to do that either. It's improper. That's not what the administration of justice is all about. And they resigned. And so at the end, as I understand it, Bove ends up having to file the motion himself along with a couple of other lawyers. And the judge almost always grants the motion, but he has the right to question the prosecutors as to why they're doing this. And I really hope he takes the opportunity to question Bove about it. But the big question here is why didn't Trump just issue a pardon? You see, this is kind of interesting. Is no question that Trump's got the pardon power, and he may be criticized for it, but he could have just said, I pardon Eric Adams from the bribery and all the related charges, and that would have been the end of the matter. And that would have been legal under our constitutional system, that nobody would have raised any ethical problems in terms of what Bove was doing with Sassoon and the other U.S. attorneys. They might have questioned the judgment of doing this and granting a pardon to this guy, but nobody would question the propriety under the Constitution of issuing a pardon. And and that hasn't been explained. But you see, a pardon doesn't put the U.S. Attorney's Office under the control of the administration. And by getting people to resign who exercise independent judgment, that say, no, this is improper, I'm not going to participate in this. And then you get lawyers to replace them and says, oh, we'll do anything you say. We'll do anything you say. Just let us have this cush job, and yeah, we'll do it. That then you get into this problem where an administration, a regime, is now in control of the prosecutorial section of the judiciary, of the executive branch, and you don't want that. You want these U.S. attorneys to exercise some degree of independence, away from the political things, where they're going after people based strictly on crimes. You do not want a system where the guy in charge, the president, is able to control U.S. attorneys and just issue instructions. Indict him, don't indict him, do this, don't do that. Now you're talking about dictatorship. And that's one of the worrisome parts of Donald Trump, is this tendency toward dictatorship. Not only with respect to his tariff policy of just raising taxes on the American people unilaterally with no congressional permission at all. Just, hey, 10% tax on anything you buy from Mexico now, and 10% tax. Now, Congress apparently has delegated this authority to him, but that's unconstitutional too. You can't. One branch of government cannot delegate its powers to another branch. And so you've got this tendency that's very dangerous. He controls the Congress, and he's raising taxes on people without congressional permission. And there are actually Republicans saying that he should ignore judicial rulings. This is phenomenal. I mean, whether you like it or not, when a federal judge issues an order saying, putting a restraining order on Trump from interfering with closing a department or agency, saying you don't have that power, that's our system. It's been our system almost from the very beginning, when the Constitution called the federal government into existence. The judiciary decides what is constitutional or not, and they're the final decider. Now, each branch can make that decision, but the final decision is by the judiciary. You have Republicans, conservatives, that are saying Trump should ignore their rulings. Wow. I mean, that removes one of the last impediments here to full dictatorship. Because once he doesn't have to answer to Congress, because Republicans control Congress, and he's just raising taxes without regard to what Congress says or not, and then he's not going to comply with judicial rulings. If that happens, you're now looking at full dictatorial powers. There is no checks. There's no checks and balances here anymore from the other two branches, and it totally negates the whole idea of judicial review. So that's my report for Trump Watch this week, and I'm sure there are going to be a lot more things to report on next week. Thank you all very much for tuning in. I'll see you next week.